Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Hello world, you're listening to Strategicon, the podcast of Sage International Australia, or SIA, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. China is a sleeping giant. Let her sleep, for when she wakes, she will move the world. Napoleon Bonaparte. The 19th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party gave Secretary-General of the party Xi Jinping a renewed and very much strengthened mandate to lead China. Premier Xi found his way to office in 2012. Xi succeeded Hu Jintao and has used his time in office to consolidate the People's Republic of China's massive economic and social gains. Strategically too, Premier Xi has reshaped China's view of the world, pushing American power back from areas considered sensitive to China's national interests in the East and South China Seas, as well as from the Korean Peninsula. China has long bought off much of the African continent in order to secure access to much-needed raw materials to fuel and sustain China's economic and strategic growth, and it has launched a policy of creating a vast network of road and rail lines that will eventually connect Africa, Central Asia, and Europe to China, known as One Belt, One Road. It was Xi who in 2013 coined the term the Chinese dream to tie up the individual and collective aspirations of the average Chinese citizen towards the Chinese superstate that is being created by Beijing. Essentially, this philosophy blended together elements of both modern socialist and ancient Confucian Chinese traditions. But these traditions are not the traditions of all Chinese people. They are the traditions of the political, social, and cultural elite of the Han people, the dominant cultural group that runs the modern Chinese political, government, and bureaucratic framework. The international community, whether from the perspective of nations, corporations, or average citizens, have considered the rise of China a foregone conclusion. China's imprint is everywhere. Much of the world's lower-cost items are produced in the PRC, making the state indispensable to lower socioeconomic consumers in the West and those in much of the underdeveloped world. Were it not for China's ability to produce cheap and moderately costed items, a business Western industry fell out of favor with well and truly over 2 decades ago, it is likely that the proliferation of computers and other mobile electronic devices would not have taken off in the same fashion as we've seen today. In many ways, China is the 21st century workshop of the world. But what is China? We tend to see China from the perspective of a very simple lens, as a unified autocratic country, well-ordered and disciplined. We believe China to be a powerful international actor backed by an enormous economy and a massive military, supplemented by clever diplomacy and a growing navy. But this is a simple lens and possibly a distorted one, for China is not a monolithic bloc. Of the 1.3 billion inhabitants of this great country, around 1 billion are not part of Xi's Chinese dream politically, socially, and certainly not economically. The gap between the rich and poor in China is enormous, and that gap is growing. Chinese wealth is concentrated along the coastal fringe, while the interior is mostly poor, third world poor. Cities have been built, abandoned, and left to ruin in speculative construction industry rorts that have cost the Chinese people and businesses new places to live and operate from. The Politburo, in spite of its ambition, is unable to work fast enough or effectively enough to redistribute wealth to all areas of China, leaving regions bereft of resources necessary for modern and productive lives. Not only that, Han cultural imperialism within China brings with it a racism that dares not speak its name. Not even foreigners who are aware of this bring it up in polite conversation, since the world needs China to succeed. It is too big to fail. Where minority or anti-state resistance is encountered, it is usually crushed with a casual brutality, making the West complicit in any crimes committed by China's ruthlessly efficient internal security forces. The West wants the continuation of trade with China as it is, even if it means the Politburo is caught cracking some skulls along the way. We can make light of China's internal conflicts, but we can't make light of the money that flows between us and China. Australia is one of many international examples of this mentality. Canberra has tied much of Australia's contemporary and future economic growth on the back of untroubled trade with China. Does this put us in moral quandary? If we believe that we stand for the liberty of the individual and for freedom from oppression, how can any Australian government in good conscience freely trade with a politically repressive state? It would be akin to open trade with the Soviet Union at the height of its power. There are those who believe that the PRC is gradually softening its internal stance against dissidents, that it's too soon in China's political evolution to grant too much liberalism to the Chinese people. After all, their economy only opened to the West in 1978. However, Premier Xi has made it clear that he wants to drive home the benefits of a strong and stable China and will not broach political, ethnic, or any other sort of opposition. So for the West, is it a case of business at any cost? To discuss these vexing and controversial issues, we are joined today by Associate Lecturer at the University of Adelaide and SIA's Resident Existentialist Philosopher, Mr. David Olney, and SIA Research Assistant, Ms. Shahrazad Garat. What can we take away from the recent 19th Party Congress in China? What was the significance of this?
To me, the most important thing was that we've really seen a new, more narrowly defined version of authoritarianism enshrined, meaning that the idea of democratic development seems less likely and the desperate desire for continuity seems more obvious.
Okay, Shaz, what do you think?
I have 4 takeaways from this. First, Xi Jinping's political philosophy was enshrined in party constitution. This official name, Xi Jinping's thought on socialism as Chinese characteristics for a new era, is a set of organizing principles that will guide China's policies for the future. Now, Chinese system is all about setting goals and getting things done. Therefore, these grand strategies are extremely important for them. Deng Xiaoping's theory, reform back in late 1970s, opened up a kickstarter for China's market reforms and resulted in decades of significant growth. Now the Communist Party hoped that Xi thought could do just that, which is deepening economic reforms, building rule of law institutions, furthermore, opening up to the world and embracing globalization. Secondly, the 19th Party Congress also charted a new timetable for China's rise. In the 1980s, the party has set a goal to transform China from the poor background country into a prosperous, modern nation by 2050. Now the new plan aims to achieve this by 2035. However, that year, most estimates forecast China's economic will be surpasses the US economy in size. Yet that is not the end of the story. She states that China will then work even harder to become full-fledged developed country by 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. Third takeaway is that she made it clear in the future, China's pollution will be a thing of the past. Of course, this is easier said than done. She stated that China will increase investment in green economy and step up environmental safeguards. Lastly, the party also identified the biggest challenge, which is called the contradiction between imbalanced and inadequate development and the people's ever-growing need for a better life. That it encompasses so many things. For example, the obvious difference between rich and poor in China, the uneven development across region and across sectors. To address that, she said China will adopt a targeted poverty alleviation strategy to eradicate poverty by 2020, deepen supply-side economic reforms, and cultivate an innovation based on economy, which frankly speaking is already taking place if you ask those who live in China long enough. On China's global road, General Secretary Xi states that China is taking the central stage of the world. That has interpreted by many as an end to Deng Xiaoping's hiding one's strengths and biding its time strategy. She also alluded to the concept of a China model. He said that China must have confidence in its path and its political system. He went one step further and stated that Chinese system offers a new alternative for those developing countries who want to generate growth while maintaining their independence. However, Beijing did not say this is a universal model. What this means is that China's model has proven a legitimate alternative to Western liberal democracy in their eyes. This model apparently has largely worked, at least for China.
I think Xi now has put his imprimatur onto the Politburo in a way that we haven't seen since Mao Zedong. This in itself shows a number of things. Firstly, that Xi is ensuring that the people of China know that Beijing will be ruled by a strong leader, and that plays well to China's domestic audience. Xi also sends a signal to the West that his leadership of the CCP will be uncompromising. But the interesting thing here, and maybe I'll toss over to David on this one, is Xi pursuing a China First policy?
I think it is very much and by necessity a China First policy, but by recognising that the global system as the West has created it can't deliver for China. They've entered the economic game too late. They've entered the political development game too late. They've entered the resource game just in time to be a major player. But they need to construct a model for a new era where most things are scarce, where democracy is subverting itself by having incredible ideals and not living up to them. So I think this is very much a way of stating, in a new world, we can be a new China, best of the old, best of the new, and the continuity really is a new form of emperor with an advanced management and ruling class, and if possible, buy off as many of the poor as humanly possible.
How do we get to the stage where the West, proud of its political and social legacy born of the Enlightenment, is comfortable dealing with a country that is illiberal as a trading partner? Has the West sold out its principles?
I think it's less a case of selling out our principles in relation to China, but that we sold them out at home. China saw this and said, well, why not? If we look that really since the election of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, the shift towards the neoconservatives in the late 1970s, early 1980s, we established a culture of greed is good, the market is right. We gave up on mixed economies, we gave up on social sort of development in the sense that the Scandinavians would understand, and we've let the oligarchy become richer year after year after year, to the point where Joseph Stiglitz is now, making very serious arguments about the price of inequality. China simply watched and saw that there's a rhetoric gap. Our rhetoric is profound and Enlightenment inspired, but our reality is economic opportunity for the rich and selling the idea of economic opportunity to everyone else. And guess what? It's worked fairly well. So I can't see any reason why our hypocrisy would be useful to China.
Okay, so we've sold ourselves down the river. But in essence, does that mean that we are in the process of creating a benevolent corruption of sorts? We're perpetrating under neoliberalism. It's a corrupt practice which China has adopted. Everyone is corrupt, everyone's making money, everyone's happy, well, apparently. So we see no alternative to this. But what does this do? I mean, ultimately, we are excusing the kind of rough-handed treatment that authoritarian capitalism can and has done to various people within China, for instance. Is that not a problem?
Well, there's a few problems in that. First of all, we're using low-cost Chinese goods to buy off the majority of Western populations who haven't had real pay rises since the 1970s or early 1980s. We're dealing with the fact that we gave up manufacturing because China could do it cheaper. So really, we still have incredible ideals and we have the wealth to implement them. But every year that goes past now is another year where China sees we can do what we like. because the West just is not willing to use its power to achieve the ideals it truly claims to value. So we've got to the point where our ideals have become aspirational rather than guiding features of how we function in the world.
I'm still trapped with the idea that, we talk so much about principles in the West, and the hypocrisy, as you rightly point out, is there. We are meant to always put our principles above everything else. I mean, the thing that actually separates us from everyone else, the children of the Enlightenment, are meant to not only feel that they had reached a sort of a civilizational evolutionary high point, but that we are trying to help other people also raise themselves up to a higher standard. And in actual fact, all we've ended up doing is facilitating and enabling the baser nature of our action. It's all about the money, right?
Yeah, somewhere along the lines we forgot that the outcome isn't the most important thing. It's how you go about living and what that tells other people about your belief system, your philosophy, your moral position, the structure of your democratic state. We've somehow, along the way, forgotten the effort we made to make a more equitable society and a more equitable economy. And all right, equitable economies are hard to manage. One of the hardest things in the world to do is to work out how much you can disincentivize wealth through high taxation and controlling people's behaviour to get cash to be able to change people's life at the other end, to empower people by giving them resources and opportunities. So the irony is now for China to say, we are going to use some of our wealth to transform people's lives. Well, the West has done this all over before. So what it really suggests is the Enlightenment's rhetoric was that if you buy into this, you're inevitably going to be changed forever. But what we see in reality is that humans don't buy into anything forever. We respond to the circumstances we're experiencing, and the Enlightenment was so big and powerful that the rhetoric of it is incredibly powerful. We need to remember that it wasn't rhetoric, that it actually transformed the world, in some ways for bad, but in most ways for good. And remember that it's not long-term aspirational, it's live it now, use it to shape decisions now. To a sense, China's balance between we need to make a bag of money, we need to get rid of pollution, and we need to pull the very poor out of poverty is a perfect Enlightenment model. It's, let the liberal economy get on with it. Look after the people who can't, and make an environment where people can have a decent life. The irony is, in their very applied authoritarian way, they're getting to the essence of trying to build a better society without the spin of 17th century and 18th century philosophy.
What you're saying is that they're actually trying to find a shortcut to getting to a gentler place, and even if it means using strong-arm tactics as a method by which they get there in the end, that's how they're going to get there?
See, I think this is where the Chinese idea is so different to the Enlightenment model. The Enlightenment model was informed by the philosophy, and then people came up with the practical action. In this case, we're seeing applied action to get the better characteristics, but that doesn't mean people will change their mind about power, about how to rule, how to dominate. So the irony is they might make the nicer, comfier authoritarian state, or with better conditions, people may wish to rise, which will then lead to social upheaval. So the Western model suited where we were at the time. The Chinese model of being in a hurry, in a time when the resources are running out, the pollution is too bad, the population's big. They don't have time to bumble, but in doing such a forced, shaped transformation, they also risk not transforming the nature of power, rule, governance, what it means to be a citizen, and just making an outwardly nicer authoritarianism, not transforming the nature of the interrelationship between citizens.
You mean communism with a human face? Haven't we been here before?
I like that. Communism is a human face.
Communism wanted to redistribute en masse. What was it? From each according to his ability to each according to his needs. The underlying idea is brilliant. China's going nowhere near that far. So not only are they not sort of buying into the Western idealism of the Enlightenment, neither are they buying into the communist idealism, that it can be groovy for everyone. And this is where that kind of pragmatism, why they can make the argument, this is a legitimate system, this has worked, it may be beneficial to other people. Because everyone else is starting the game from, we're almost post-industrial in a lot of countries. Any country who's going to industrialise now will only do it with support of, global markets. They're going to have to take massive control of their population, their environment to do it. The game that the West experienced is not the game that's being played anymore. The rules have changed. And the only question I think really is, has China got an underlying sense of morality to curb excess and civilise power, or will it use excess and power to get to this supposedly better place, only to find that the authoritarianism is still doing harm?
We are making a huge assumption here, of course, and that is that the Politburo is going to be in charge of China for the foreseeable future. Not having a crystal ball in front of me, and obviously crystal ball gazing is a very dangerous thing, but that's the nature of strategic forecasting, I suppose. But if we project forward, we can't ever be really 100% certain that the Politburo will be in charge, and maybe a new form of technocratic leadership based on purely Confucian ideology will come through, which may very well solve some of the problems in terms of philosophy and a sort of more gentler approach in managing the size of population that they have currently and the diversity of that population.
Or we can take the P.W. Singer line from Ghost Fleet of a combination of a very capable modern military, a very capable business elite, and the technocrats who support both groups, essentially making a soft nationalism and creating consumers who are so busy shaping their own individual lives and going, I live in a great country, that you essentially disempower as many people as possible. So if they wanted to look out at the West, where democracy is not achieving the things it should, it's not transforming the economy effectively, it's not dealing with environmental problems effectively. We've been individuated to the point of losing the ability for collective action. Now, if you're an authoritarian state and you want to maintain authoritarian rule, you want to atomize your population. You want them to be so busy consuming and entertaining themselves that they don't pose a collective political threat. So the idea of a sophisticated philosophical elite doing a neo-Confucianism model to get continuity overall, that's a collective, and a collective is always dangerous. It seems to me that the modern version of political development must always aim to atomize people if it's going to sustain power. So the real question for China's future, the real people question, is can the Politburo atomize the population sufficiently to ruin the capacity for collective action? Or will the people hang on to culture, identity, and shared purpose in a way that allows for an alternative to the Politburo?
Okay, well, it has been said that democracies don't go to war with each other. But when democracies trade with autocracies, do democracies and autocracies go to war with each other? The initial argument states that leaders of democracies don't go to war with each other because there's no interest in it. If you're busy making money and supporting institutions that are conducive to non-warlike competitive pursuits, why would you go out of your way to destroy this arrangement? Does China buy this concept? Can they be brought in to play the game of democratic peace in spite of not being democratic?
I suppose the first thing that jumps out at me is this idea of countries that trade with each other. Now that suggests that there's some sort of balance. We trade with each other. Whereas what we see with China and the United States is an imbalance. China desperately needs to develop, and America desperately needed to outsource manufacturing to lower costs of doing things to enable people to have a quality of life without having an increase in income. So they are fulfilling each other's needs. If we look to, say, Organsky's power transition theory, developed during the Cold War, and it was looking at how you might transition between, two powers in a Cold War context, where the context stayed the same, and one country wanted to place another as the dominant power in that context. But what we're seeing here is a change in context. Fukuyama's dream of eating pineapple on the moon has not happened. Liberal democracy doesn't appear to be spreading wildly and being picked up by everybody. The environmental issues we're facing, the scarcity issues we're facing, means whatever economy we're going to get is going to be different. So what we're seeing is a country that had done well grabbing hold, and a country that is starting to do well grabbing hold, because they both need what each other can provide. Now, whether they can squeeze each other to death, why not? because they either stand up together and we get the imbalance we have now of the old and the new uncomfortably fit together, or we get them pressurizing each other, but without Western wealth to buy stuff, and without the Chinese ability to make stuff, without the Chinese ability to effectively pull resources out of places like Africa to move manufacturing from China onto the next tier of manufacturing, we won't keep a global economy going until we get a major transformation in the nature of that economy.
I want to ask a question here. We're living in a globalized world where everything is so interdependent. Democracies and autocracies, whether we're talking about China or any other autocracy in the world, for instance, is all part of a part of the global economic fabric. The interdependencies on trade is creating a system whereby autocracies, except for the extreme end of the equation like a North Korea that is so isolated from anything that it really doesn't make any difference whether they go to war tomorrow or not. But most states are to a greater degree integrated within the global commons. There is no real imperative by any near-peer competitor of the United States, and here we can actually talk about China, to actually press the Americans to a point of shooting across someone's bow. Because obviously democratic peace isn't about democracy, it's about the economy.
The economy is the continuity, and the need to stabilise your society to maintain power is consistent. We have as much social upheaval now in the United States as we see in China. One is protesting to gain things, the other is protesting to not lose things. So if we take the relative deprivation argument, you can want things to get better, but you can also not want things to get worse. So there is such an interdependence now that if they want to have a shooting war, it doesn't just disrupt them, it disrupts everybody. But by the very nature of the fact that China will not have cheap labour forever, will not want to do really dirty manufacturing forever if it wants to be a cleaner environment, it will outsource some of this to somewhere else. Someone else will be given a go. It's not that China are the only people that can do all these things. They're the only people doing them now. We can't imagine the discomfort of 5 years without a new TV.
Beijing has made it clear that China will not broach foreign interference close to its sensitive eastern seaboard, challenging American air and naval supremacy and those of American allies in Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and places like the East China Sea and the South China Sea. Is it correct to view China as the young line circling the old line, namely the United States, or are analyses describing the international transfer of power from the US to China overblown? Are we facing the classic strategic dilemma of a Thucydides trap, where war between the US and the PRC is inevitable?
I'd like to turn the lion analogy around and say it's that the old lion got some anti-arthritis meds.
Yeah, China is actually the older of
China is the old lion, and
exactly.
it's got some anti-arthritis meds, and it's limbering up. It's going to put some muscle bulk back on, get its teeth sharpened, get itself brushed down. Historically, it knew how to deal with outside problems. It knew how to get some level of internal continuity. It has an incredible history and heritage of maintaining control at almost any point other than when it's tearing itself to pieces. America's young and doesn't have that kind of history to fall back on. It has recent wealth, recent power. And if the old lessons become relevant again, you'd be crazy to bet against the old lion. Whether the two lions have to go to war probably depends on whether they think they can win. Again, rarely do lions fight to the point of killing each other. It's too costly. If you get injured, you can't hunt, you're not relevant. So either fight and win, or fight a bit and run away. Bit hard to conceive how anyone could start this and then run away, which suggests we could have decades of talking about whether there's going to be a war, because if it does kick off, as we've talked about before in the Ghost Fleet episode, how many days of 5th generation warfare could we survive? Or, in 10 years' time, 6th generation warfare, before every expensive piece of kit and every hyper-talented person who uses that kit are all dead. And then what? So do we end up at a point where war is just so costly that we come up with war by other means? Do we start, using population control, resource control, rather than direct warfare? Do we have an era of indirect warfare? It's quite possible to imagine indirect warfare between the two. Levels of influence, spheres of influence. That will be the way they will get what they need and want and take things away from each other.
Looking at a demographic map of China, most of the country's industry and population is based on the eastern seaboard. This makes China especially vulnerable to foreign naval pressure and intimidation. China has little strategic depth. Furthermore, much of its weaponry does not come out of Chinese factories. Most of it comes from Russian sources, though no doubt this may change over time. But again, this unhealthy web of dependence on Moscow makes China vulnerable to external pressure. If Moscow and Beijing diverge in a significant way, Russian arms supplies to China may dry up. Do these two fundamental vulnerabilities upset Chinese views of its international power? With these critical vulnerabilities, does this make China an atypical rising power?
I think with the first part of that, we have to go back to One Belt, One Road. If you're worried about what can happen in the maritime theatre, then have a second alternative. And, rail lines running across the world, pipelines running across the world, in countries where people just desperately want development, where China can build relationships with populations who are just glad for an opportunity, which then potentially changes the demographic situation, because China genuinely, perhaps along these rail and pipelines, have populations who go, life is so much better with the constant flow of trade and finance, that suddenly China does genuinely have the client states that it failed to gain when it did the Great Voyages. It didn't find anyone at the time worthy of being a client state. Well, the advantage of the railway lines and pipelines, you bring everything to people's doors and you can pick up anything they've got and take it back to China. It seems there you solve demographic problems, you solve the maritime problem, you open up the ability to be a far more extensive and interconnected China. And by the time we're at 6th or 7th generation weapon systems, why would we assume that the Russians are still going to be ahead of the game? Do you think they're going to keep their edge?
Look, I think that there's an issue with regard to giving Moscow such a head start in terms of being a supplier to a big market like China. Because ultimately the Politburo will make a calculation based on a couple of things. Firstly, the expense necessary to create its own domestic military industrial complex. Now, it's already taken its first steps in that direction. It does supply AK-47 derivatives and Soviet-derived, now Chinese-manufactured artillery to third world countries. And, it makes a reasonable living from it. But, when it comes to a major shooting war with a near-peer competitor like Russia or, for instance, Vietnam or, for instance, South Korea, I think that you will find that some of those weapons that come out of China's stocks at this point in time would not really be of the required technology to push back in order to, have that standard Soviet World War II tactic of human wave, or even the Chinese strategy during the Korean War of human wave and pushing people back with less sophisticated weaponry. What happens 25 years from now when China's industrial base is more indigenous and has more technology? That's a discussion that we can have at some later point. But if we're talking about now and the near term, I think that China is atypical as a rising power because, generally speaking, rising powers, the first thing they do, they find out how to manufacture the weapon. We saw that with the Japanese, for instance. The Japanese were, in the early Meiji period, they were surrounded by what they considered threats, and the first thing they did was they sent their envoys off to, one envoy off to Britain to find out how to build a navy, another one off to Germany to find out how to build an army. And we know how that went. With China, they don't seem to have, or the Politburo doesn't seem to have the ambition to invest that much of its national capital because it is ultimately a money-making enterprise. The Politburo likes to make money. They like to put the money in their pocket. They don't necessarily want to give it all away to the generals because that will create another kind of headache for them down the track.
Or is this another case where they've got the advantage of having seen the ruinous wars of the 20th century?
And now we'll take a short break here. You're listening to Strategicon, the podcast of SIA.
The U.S. began deployment of a controversial.
也可能会在军事安全领域采取相对。
How many times do I had to warn you, my lovely little neighbor boy? You don't really want a little toy, you know? Your big brother's annoyed, trying to avoid the sight of me, and he stole a camera in my room. Why? You always got so many faces. Or maybe I could ignore some of those small cases, but not this time, kid. You're going too far. The things you're doing now is gonna rip you apart.
I'm spinning over the words you may never heard, and it maybe not aim but manifest more about you than lesson. There's always something that we wanna be trying to reverse the views about China. We're not a brand newcomer, and I mean what I say, and I mean that it seems like you never wanna be written to me. But some 21st century colonies, some probably committed felonies. See, not to make me see what's stop. Tell me the why, ain't gonna tell me that you're proud. But I love you, kid, you are getting rest.
Tell me, do you like violence? No. Tell me, should we have to choose silence? No. Now I'm telling everybody all over the globe about that. We say no, no, no. Tell me, do you like violence? No. Tell me, should we have to choose silence? No. Now I'm telling everybody all over the globe about that. We say no, no, no.
木亚兰在这里，我要对你提出批评，你傻得彻底，活该外界对你产生抵触心情。脑残记住。
That was CD Rev, a state-sanctioned Chinese rap group singing against the US deployment of its Terminal High-Altitude Area Defense System, or THAAD. An inspired choice for our musical interlude. Thank you, Shaz. Let's now return to Strategicon episode 39, Fitness to Rule.
That if you build up to near-peer conflict, you end up with World War One. Now that was World War One with, by today's standards, pretty basic technology. And absolutely devastating. So, does this mean for them cyber warfare, space, indirect warfare, perhaps taking some major leap in terms of maritime warfare, what they can do with drones or what they can do with submarines, doing something that hasn't been done yet? Do they want to avoid what was because they can see it's too late to get in that game?
We'll actually return to that in a moment. I'm going to ask this question of Shaz. I mean, is it wrong to assume that China is internally cohesive? China, like all other modern states, is a polyglot of different cultures and ethnicities, usually dominated by one group that then becomes associated with the nation's origins and mythology. In China's case, being acculturated to Han Chinese social norms makes those citizens part of the dominant cultural group. However, there are some 56 ethnic groups in China. The Han is by far the largest, representing some 90% of China's population. But those who are not Han and do not subscribe to suppressing their ethnic and cultural identities to belong to the Han group are easy targets for persecution. Two such groups currently under the gaze of Beijing are the Uyghurs and the Tibetans. What is the state of intercommunal harmony within China? What is being done by Beijing to China's minorities?
I'll answer your questions in 3 different points, John. Yes, it is definitely wrong to assume that China is internally cohesive. If anything, they are more fragile than before. As you have mentioned, around 90% of the People's Republic of China currently identified as Han Chinese, which will certainly give the appearance of an extremely homogeneous country. However, this is extremely misleading, as there is also a large amount of linguistic, cultural, and genetic diversity, not only within other non-Sinitic groups in China, but within the Han Chinese population as well. The question is that why China is seemingly so genetically and linguistically homogeneous when compared to other countries and regions of the same size? How can almost 1.3 billion people in the world's most populous country be classified as the same ethnic group when places like India and Africa with similar population have 100, if not 1,000 ethnic groups, with no group being in the majority? It is extremely convenient to simply classify all those that identify as Han as ethnic Chinese, but is it accurate? There is also less intercommunal harmony in China. On the paper, the constitution states that China represents all 56 minorities in its region, but in reality, things are very different for each minorities. How are these groups treated in Chinese society, you may ask? The minorities increasingly been moved towards rural areas of China, and now they are resisting that trend as minorities in China often face heavy discrimination in the cities. Their isolation is leading to unrest, separatist feeling, and in some cases, violence. One group that have been heavily marginalized are the Uyghurs. The term Uyghur describes the Turkic Muslim indigenous to the region of northwest China, and there are mostly Muslim minorities. It is clear that China is urbanizing at a rapid pace. Nearly two-thirds of the Chinese were on the farm in the year 2000. Now that proportion is far less than half, as everyone is moved to the cities. However, the Uyghurs have just not done so. Less than 1% of the Uyghurs have migrated from their native-born country, Xinjiang, to the rest of the China to work. And 83% of Uyghurs were farmers in the 2010 census, an even higher proportion than in 2000. Why is this, you may ask? Over China's turbulent 69-year rule of Xinjiang, Uyghur Autonomous Region, for example, the Uyghurs have been the victim of violent repression. The Uyghurs gradually have lost their culture, language, and religion under the Chinese Communist Party control. The Uyghurs are excluded from important positions in administrative, economic, and political bodies. Consequently, Uyghurs often remained unrepresented, as well as unemployed or employed under extremely poor working conditions. The Uyghurs are subjected to extreme birth control and forced abortion since 1984. This has never been brought up to the outside media due to the lack of freedom of speech. And even when there were outside media, the Communist Party made sure that these types of news won't reach out to the outside world. On top of that, the Uyghurs have been silenced by lifetime imprisonment and death penalties for any crime they have committed. With Tibetans, the story is very similar. Tibetans' population is around 8 million in the region of Tibet, and the surrounding areas are distantly related to the Han Chinese. However, linguistically, they are closely related to the Bama people of Myanmar, along with various Tibetic-related groups in northern Nepal, northeast India, and Bhutan. More than 80% of Tibetans to remain farmers, and only 1% Tibetans have left Tibet to work from the 5 provinces that encompass their homeland in southwest China. When they make it to the city, they end up in menial or low-paid jobs. They encounter much the same discrimination as Uyghurs. Tibetans look very different to other Han Chinese. Most of them doesn't speak Chinese very well and often faces difficulties integrating into the cities that they live. They don't really feel like they're at home in these cities. The government policies in China is a part of the reason why the minority groups are facing these problems and conflicts. One of the major issues is that China claims Uyghurs have been the center of a number of terrorist incidents in the recent years. Therefore, the focus of government policy, especially after 9/11 and after 2009 Urumqi riot, has been a crackdown instead of provide economic opportunities for those minorities. Most of the Chinese policies focuses on security, not economic access. These conditions that Uyghurs and the Tibetans are currently facing will not change anytime soon, and certainly government policy is still conflicted.
So, China's closest international friends are states that share an interest in maintaining themselves, states such as North Korea, Russia, and Myanmar or Burma. All share Beijing's concern that their regimes are not toppled. Looking at Burma and the way that it's handling the Rohingya refugee crisis, are there parallels between the Burmese treatment of the Rohingya and how China treats its minorities? Are the Burmese taking advice from China on these matters? David?
I'm not familiar enough with what's going on in northwest China, but I would definitely say that there seem to be very big parallels with Tibet. That a lot of the lessons the Chinese learnt from managing the Tibetans since the 1950s seem to be being applied very quickly in Burma. You know, the Burmese generals put on suits, have had a go at guided democracy, but at the end of the day they will manage nationalism, they will manage to find an enemy to label as the problem, and they will apply pressure without remorse. And these lessons seem to be more than likely lessons that, okay, the Brits would have taught them divide and conquer, but this appears to be a more efficient and more recent variant of how to, control and do harm to a minority. And one would suggest then that it probably is from China that these skills have emerged.
The Burmese military obviously do take their cues from China. They basically get a lot of Chinese equipment, a lot of training. So it stands to reason that obviously the current generalissimos within Burma have an idea of how to efficiently dispatch according to how the Chinese are actually training their soldiers. So it makes perfect sense. Shaz, do you want to say something here?
Yeah, for me, I understand that the Chinese region endorses the Burma crackdown against Rohingyas, Muslim insurgents. They are stating that the rest of the world should let the Burma government to sort its internal affairs. Once again, the Chinese regime is clocking international efforts to interfere the affairs of another country, like they did with the violence in Sudan or the nuclear weapons development in North Korea for years. This is a very common strategy of Chinese Communist Party. Why? Because China wants Burma to remember that when everyone is slapping Burma's hand, it is China who stood behind Burma with its support in the United Nations. China has big political interests in Myanmar. For one, China is battling the US over their influence in Burma. So following the end of the military junta in 2011, the US eased up on the sanctions that has been in place for 2 decades. Obama became the first president to visit Burma while in office. This have definitely worried Chinese Communist Party, as the last thing they want is another US ally right on its border. China did show their concern regarding the violence in Burma, but China is good at contemplating an idea that it is going along with the Western order while assuring Burma that it won't really put the screws on them. The reality is that China cannot really put the screws on Burma for its treatment of Muslim minorities, as it will sound very hypocritical considering the Communist Party treatment of its own Muslim minorities like the Uyghurs. Communist Party of China will hate to sound hypocritical on something. I will say that there are many parallels between the Burmese treatment of Rohingyas and the Chinese treatment of its minority ethnic group such as Uyghurs. The difference, however, is that the grievances of Rohingyas are widely known in the Western media, and some of the leaders in the West have, or at least spoken about the Burmese treatment of the Rohingyas. For example, 2 years ago, President Barack Obama have spoken about his concerns regarding Rohingyas' fate in Burma, but little to no Western officials have said anything about China's treatment of its Muslim minorities like Uyghurs. In fact, some Western authority believes what China described of the Uyghurs people, which is they are extreme separates or terrorists.
The Chinese view of Islam today, and this was promulgated under the Bush years and America's virulent anti-Islam crusade following on from 9/11. Obviously, Russia also plays into this against its Chechen separatists and various other separatists in the southern Caucasus area. So, we're seeing this thing develop in an international way. It's kind of funny that one side of the equation feeds off the other. The Americans initially after 9/11, then of course the Chinese take up the cudgels, the Russians take up the cudgels, and they're now looking at the Americans and saying, well, yeah, yes, we're doing this, but then you guys started it because you were going after Osama bin Laden at the time, and it seemed like a good idea at the time for us too, because we've got our own internal separatists who we consider dangerous individuals to the state, so we'll crack down on them as brutally. What do you reckon, David?
We get back to what we were talking about at the very beginning. The fact that the West threw away its advantage of its ideals and its philosophy. We essentially go to Burma and go, that's bad, don't do that, and then do nothing. Whereas at least China just quietly keeps doing what China does. Going, well, you gave us the opportunity to persecute our Muslim minority, and we're just going to do it quietly. We're not going to let anyone put too much attention on this. So we're going to, make the right face, that the Burmese should be nice, but at the end of the day, same thing. They're not going to intervene, and they're not going to be hypocrites.
I hate to actually sort of stray slightly off topic. In the Burmese case, we did have the figurehead of Aung San Suu Kyi, who fought the noble fight of trying to bring democracy to the Burmese people against a military junta that was basically lock, stock and two smoking barrels bought out by Chinese interests. So once Aung San Suu Kyi made her Faustian deal with the Burmese military, she becomes the democratic figurehead, only to turn the other way when her own military, Chinese supported, goes after the Rohingya. Irony?
It's kind of amazing that the most effective way to neutralise an incredible spokesperson for democracy was to let her out and actually involve her in practical politics. The tar couldn't stick to the feathers fast enough.
Yeah, true. So let's return to cyberspace and space are two areas in which China is making major headway. China is certainly on the path of becoming the next big space power, although a lot of high-tech rocketry science is dependent on Russian technology. China's PLA Unit 61398 is notorious for having penetrated Western government and corporate cyber systems, either to disrupt them or steal from them. So what exactly does that make China to the West? A friend or an enemy? And are we already engaged in a cyber war with China?
Oh, we're most definitely already engaged. And this is the critical thing about the new world of cyber. In cyber, you don't shoot someone, they don't fall down. You can't extract a bullet, you can't work out what they got shot by, and you can't work out what the trajectory was to the muzzle of the weapon. It's a form of warfare where there is no obvious perpetrator, and perhaps no one but the target even knows anything happened. If the system is corrupted or the files are stolen, you don't let anyone know, no one may know. So this sort of indirect world where we can't see immediate consequences of conflict, we're going to have to be very careful that by saying, warfare, we think we know what that word means. Because in this indirect world where there may or may not be obvious evidence of the attack, there may be no clear way to work out who the attacker was. It's kind of probably good for the Chinese to have a military unit who look like the boogeyman.
Well, speaking of the Chinese military unit, what was it, a couple of weeks ago now, there was a story about China's H-6 bomber, which again is a sort of re-engineered Soviet type of aircraft, flying within the vicinity of Guam with reputedly a so-called Guam killer weapon on board, which, made the headlines, sounded great. But ultimately, we go back to how hard power is the thing that we see and the thing that we understand over and above cyber. Cyber is subterranean and will probably stay that way for a while. And therefore, in the public imaginings, it will be threatening because we can't actually, really wrap our heads around it. We understand war to be about soldiers and warships and warplanes and missiles. That's stuff we can see. The stuff that we can't see is the stuff that's really the most dangerous to us.
And that's why the Chinese need to invest enough in looking credible at conventional warfare as we traditionally understand it. Because it is what populations understand. It can intimidate. It can make people, think again. Whereas cyber will be where probably most of the indirect battles of the future happen. Because the costs are lower, the gains are potentially higher, the ability to avoid outright war or being proved that you started it is so high. It's impossible to imagine why China wouldn't try and become the world's most significant player at cyber warfare. It's the logical thing to do at the moment as a rising power.
Okay, we talk about hard power as if it matters, and it does, right? But last week we saw 3 US aircraft carrier battle groups exercise together in the Pacific Ocean at the same time that President Trump was touring Asia. This was the first time in 10 years that the world has seen this American maritime might on display. Speculation has it that Trump wanted to signal to America's allies in the region that the US still had the capability and the will to intervene in force should circumstances necessitate. That the exercise was designed to intimidate both the Chinese and the North Koreans reminded them of US power. But knowing that this exercise was not a permanent fixture of US naval deployments to the Western Pacific, how effective was this exercise in staring down Beijing and Pyongyang? Surely they'll just wait until the carriers redeploy before they start up with their own military and naval maneuvers.
That was my assumption, that really all it would have done for the Chinese in particular is confirm that, yes, we need enough conventional military force to look credible as a major power, but to invest in all the things that are harder to trace, track, and identify. That when you see that, you go, well, they can only put 3 carrier groups together occasionally, but they still can do it when they really want to. So let's get to the point where in the long run where they can't do it, but not because we fight them at sea, but because quite simply the ship stops working. The game is to either, have a platform that can kill a platform, or have a piece of code that can stop the platform being useful. Doesn't matter how you win.
Webs of dependence.
Yeah.
So to quote a blog from a friend and colleague of mine, Professor Julian Lindley French, and I quote, "What is wrong with Trump foreign policy? There was an audible hissing sound as President Trump gave his ill-judged America First speech to the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in Da Nang, Vietnam this past Thursday, the 9th of November. It was the sound of hot air escaping from the balloon marked American influence in Asia. After he spoke, another balloon, a big red one, was inflating. It read Chinese influence in Asia, something that President Xi rammed home in his speech the same day. The sight of an American president calling essentially for protectionism and a Chinese president championing free trade, albeit pretend free trade, added yet another perceived twist to America's topsy-turvy foreign policy." End quote. What will a Chinese international order look like? Will it resemble anything like the current American international order?
I guess it depends on time frame, doesn't it? You know, if we look in the next few years, if One Belt, One Road starts to happen, then the Chinese bring genuine economic opportunity to more people faster than at any point in human history. And that has to have a profound impact, and therefore look different to anything before it because of the scale and pace.
It'd look fascist.
Yeah, but we're talking about economic development and influence. See, I was thinking about the wonderful word influence. I could influence you to eat pizza. I could influence you to eat chocolate.
Yes, you could.
I can influence you in lots of different ways, but it's all just influence. Yeah. So, influence is neither morally good or morally bad. It just is. And the Chinese bring with them the certainty of economic activity and the uncertainty of what they want to become and how they might behave in the future. So with China comes ambiguity. With America comes the rhetoric gap between what they say and what they do, and that in the main, their form of globalization benefited them far more than it benefited anyone else.
So it really comes down to a very simple thing called trust. So if trust and consistency. So if, for instance, you promise me something, you're China, you promise me, Kenya, a rail line from Ethiopia to Kenya, and you deliver on that. But then America, Shaz, you come in and you say, hey, there, sunshine, I'm going to promise you X, Y, and Z, and you don't deliver because you find Kenyan local politics not to your liking, for instance. That means that the local Kenyan leadership will probably look more favourably toward China because you're not asking me too much for me to accept the goods that you're providing me. Whereas if I say, well, Uncle Sam, yeah, I really like that rail line and that technology looks really, really super cool. What do I have to do? And then you tell me I'm going to have to alter everything that I do, in Nairobi. I mean, I'm going to go with China. Would that be?
Yeah, because it is that thing of the Americans often brought two kinds of influence. Be like us and use our stuff and rely on us, all three kinds of influence. We don't know what the Chinese ambiguity will morph into at this point. But thus far, they build, they deliver. And there may be massive consequences that we find uncomfortable to minorities and environments. But countries keep signing up for the next deal because they get more done faster than they've ever been able to achieve. And if they don't care about their minority or their environment, they're probably grateful that the Chinese don't either. Again, if people are left in their state of, we can deal with this being damaged, or we can deal with that group of people being excluded, and that's not pointed out, that why are you tolerating these bad things? It's nice being left alone in terms of your moral perspective on the world, or lack of it. So China perhaps is very appealing in its consistency and in its ambiguity, even though you may not be sure what they're going to do to you later. At the moment, it's the best deal in town.
Talking about ambiguity about China's influence, and we were talking, or sort of hinting about influence operations, Australia's role in all of this is fascinating because as China grows, its influence over us also increases. And it's done so in a very arguably unpalatable way. In September 2016, Australian Labor Senator Sam Dastyari resigned from the Labor Party's shadow front bench after it was discovered that he received monies from Chinese business interests covering the expenses for a trip and a legal bill. Dastyari then made a number of public appearances where he spoke in favour of China's position on the South China Sea, placing himself at odds with both his own Labour Party as well as the Turnbull government. Was this the case of China conducting an influence operation?
Most definitely.
I won't doubt it either.
Yeah, I think that this is where the thin edge of the wedge gets to us. You know, we can talk in a theoretical sense about the power of China, but it's not until it actually has manifested itself that all of a sudden it becomes real. You know, it's not theory anymore. We did have a politician. He did fall from grace as a consequence of accepting foreign monies. And I think that the whole notion of foreign donors into the political process also opens us up to all kinds of problems here in Australia, which we will have to play out at some point. I don't think it's going to sort of necessarily be a good thing for us, but so long as our major political parties will continue accepting donations from overseas interests, it then puts Australia squarely in the lap of those overseas interests, whether they be Chinese or anyone else for that matter.
Well, we also see here that it's not just short-term influence operations. When we've got senior people from Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade giving speeches that we should be very careful of Chinese influence within our universities. That doesn't impact on today's politics or economics, but it transforms what the acceptable debate might be decades from now.
Well, I was going to actually say something about, criticising the overt influence Confucian institutions have on our major universities in Australia. That they propagate a soft and friendly view of Chinese culture, so long as nothing bad is said about the Politburo. Some have claimed that the Confucian Institutes spy on Chinese nationals attending Australian universities and keep an eye out for Australian scholars who may take a dim view of how China is managed under the current political order. Surely in the post-war, post-Cold War, post-modern world we live in, such behaviour is a thing of the past. Come on, David.
Well, there's two things going on there. We're back to Chinese ambiguity. At one level, they are incredibly important to the 21st century, and it's in all our interests to know and understand China. And learning about culture, language, tradition is really nice. We don't see the average Chinese person we meet as, strange and dangerous. It's just a person with their own culture, with an incredible amount of history and subtlety and sophistication. So with everything China does, we're always seeing these spectrums where at one end there's this very clear, positive, acceptable face of the old lion getting its anti-arthritis meds and walking around the stage again. Now, it hasn't bitten anyone yet. It's a lion, though.
Yeah.
And really, it doesn't matter what a lion's doing. A lion is a lion. So this ambiguity of, on one hand, soft power so we're familiar with an important player, why would we have a problem with that? We have an American Studies Centre at, University of Sydney, essentially doing the same role.
Some would actually say that the Chinese are not very sophisticated when it comes to, trying to put their influence over us. But the Americans are incredibly sophisticated. They've got things like the CIA and the NSA running deep cover operations and having done all kinds of things during the Cold War and after the Cold War to its allies as well as to its enemies. So what then, if you were to take a sort of either-or situation, what would be worse? China doing an influence operation on an Australian politician, or the United States having perhaps toppled a couple of governments and changed the course and the history of a country? What is the worst of the two options at this point in time?
The one you're currently facing.
Yeah.
So historically we can assume there's probably been CIA interference in a multitude of things that affect Australia. But for the foreseeable future, it's more likely Chinese influence that will affect political and economic outcomes for Australia. So historically, very interesting to understand different phases, different players, but we exist now where China are the effective practical players who don't need it to be clandestine, don't need it to have a multi-billion-dollar black budget. They just set up Confucius centres. And they just settle business people who then donate to politics. It's such a simple way to subvert a system, and it shows how simple our system is.
It
so
really
easy
does.
to subvert.
It really does. I mean, on a final point, Dr. Clive Hamilton, Professor of Public Ethics at Charles Sturt University, a well-known Australian academic and author, has recently had his latest book, critical of China, put on ice by publishers Allen and Unwin. Apparently, pressure was placed on Allen and Unwin by Chinese sources and their agents here in Australia, threatening legal action were the book to be published. What does this sort of behaviour say about how our relationship with China will progress as China believes it is strong enough to exercise this sort of influence on a distant democracy? What does it say about the Australian government that it has neither the capacity nor the will to push back against this sort of Chinese behaviour? Are we in Australia ripe to become a tributary state of the PRC?
From an authoritarian perspective, getting a book put on ice is just run-of-the-mill day-to-day business.
Yeah, but it's in Australia, not in China.
Yeah, but it says far more about Australia in our pathetic response. Why didn't some major philanthropic organisation or security research centre with a bag of money publish the book the next day?
Yeah.
What is pathetic is not that China tried it. Well, of course they're going to try it. At the moment, they need as clean an image as possible so that one day if they have a clean image, their past doesn't come back and haunt them. And if they don't have a clean image, they just get better at looking like they've got a clean image. Either way, it's that ambiguity again.
Yeah.
But in the case of Australia not going, that is a thoughtful piece of writing from a thoughtful writer who has consistently done a good job of the things he does in our country under our rules. And if we are going to allow commercial interests to mean it's not published, then why not use philanthropic money, or dare I say, state money, to publish the book and improve the quality of the debate about the future of China?
Use state money to publish a book?
About China?
Oh my God.
Well, I live in hope.
You're a communist. Anyway, I think that's a wrap. Thanks very much for your time, David and Shahrazad.
Goodbye from me, Shahrazad.
Goodbye from me, David.
This is Strategicon. I'm John Bruni, and that's the show for now. You can subscribe and download Strategicon through iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn, and YouTube, as well as from sageinternational.org.au. If you want to know more about Sage International Australia, check out our pages on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and our website sageinternational.org.au. Until next time, goodbye.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.